I just have a few slides to start the discussion. We knew that this would probably be a section that would get a lot of interest. It's hard when you send these, we want to send them out in advance, but I think it is important to provide context for these slides. So if I'm just going to spend a few minutes walking through these 3 slides, and then we'll open it up for the group discussion. So clearly, we heard some discussion this morning about, the systems in North Carolina and South Carolina, et cetera. But let me just start with the graphic on the bottom. So what this shows in the light blue is counties served by DEP in both North and South Carolina. In the green, it's DEC, and in the dark blue, it's shared county. The county split in the middle, some served by DEC and some by DEP. So this expansive system that we have that spans 2 states between DEC and DEP provides scale and scope to the benefit of our customers, allows us to provide reliable and low cost generation that's below national average rates. And as we move towards decarbonization, this scale and scope is going to be beneficial in that decarbonization effort. And it's going to be a system that will continue to gain those benefits from being operated jointly across both states. However, if we look at the law itself in 951 asks us to account for a very specific metric, which is carbon emissions in the North Carolina portion of that joint service territory. So we will, in our planning, certainly report, and Nate spoke about it, we had stakeholders talking about this. It's really important to us to always keep our eye on the total system and decarbonizing the total system. As we do that, there will be, as it has always been the case, resources may or may not be sited in North Carolina. And if a new or existing gas plant that is in South Carolina or outside of North Carolina has a different accounting impact than it does for one in North Carolina when you're looking at North Carolina emissions. So from just a pure carbon accounting, we have to look at both states independently as we do the accounting, but we are certainly focused on reducing carbon emissions for the total system. It just may be that the accounting of that, you get a slightly different number in North Carolina than you do in South Carolina. So when we set up a model, we don't cite resources. We don't know in 7 or 8 years or 10 years where in a lot of cases, we don't know exactly where that resource will be. So there's a different process that comes downstream when you cite a resource than is known when you model. So we're just saying that when we show carbon emissions, we're going to show North Carolina, South Carolina, and total system, or North Carolina, is specifically called out in the legislation. So, we're going to need to report on that, but certainly, our objective is to reduce carbon emissions of the total system. So that's one big issue we're gonna focus on in this discussion. And then the other one is simply the timing and types of technologies that could be part of a portfolio reaching that interim goal, right? So the legislature clearly called out 2 specific technologies that are on the horizon for the Carolinas when it called out offshore wind and new nuclear. And it specifically granted the commission some flexibility in its timing of the interim goal if those 2 resources were to be selected by the commission as prudent in the achievement of that interim goal. And let me back up and start by saying, we're not here today to try, I heard a lot of discussion and I heard a lot of passion of particular resource types or paths. We're not making any judgment or selection of what is the preferred path or what resources are quote unquote good or bad today. We're simply outlining a framework from which to evaluate different pathways. And so without, and I know we all have, with 300 and some people on the call, I guess now we're down to 282, I see, we all have different opinions going into this. That's really not what we're trying to do here, is to say, oh, this resource should be in or shouldn't. It's simply to outline what resources need to be analyzed so that the commission has all the information it needs that covered the waterfront of what was envisioned in the legislation. And so clearly the legislation called for us to examine new nuclear and offshore wind. They were explicitly called out, and it explicitly granted the commission some flexibility in the timing of bringing those commercial, if that was deemed to be the best, which again, let's try not to say whether it is or not. It's easy to try and jump to that solution. Today, we're really trying to talk just about the framework. Doug, or I'm sorry, it's not Doug, it's Trevor. Trevor, would you please advance the slide?
It's actually Alyssa.
Oh, well, Alyssa, thank you. Lots of help, and I'll take it. So if you look at this, is a little bit of a reminder from the first meeting, there's been tremendous progress made today. Duke has been retiring coal plants and replacing them with efficient gas, as well as significant amounts of solar. We've lowered our carbon emissions. We're one of the industry leaders in low carbon intensity emissions, and there's still significant work to go. So we set up sort of the benchmark of 2005 baseline, where we were as of the last reporting data, and where we need to get to reach that 70% target. And so there's significant work to do, and it's going to take a mix of resources. A lot of good discussion earlier today about there is no one tool in the toolbox that's going to get you to the target. It is going to take a variety of resources. And then the question becomes, well, how do you develop, those portfolios, which we'll sort of get to on the next slide. But if you move from that left part of this graphic to the right, this graphic had the simple intent to say different resources that are available to help meet this goal have different characteristics, have different impacts. These are not the exact numbers. This is a very high level estimate. Each resource, it's very dependent upon how much utilization it has, what's the marginal carbon it's displacing when it's brought on the system, how they interact with each other. Certainly, as you add more of any of these resources, that whole bar moves to the left. As you saturate a given resource, the next tranche of that resource is less effective in removing carbon than the tranche before it, by definition. As you start to saturate the need for that particular resource, you're displacing ever lower carbon on the margin as you add more and more of it. So all of these resources, this is really not intended to say, and I knew when we put the slide together, someone would try and say, well, I can just pick from this almost like a menu at a restaurant and add up to 24. And there's how I think we should reach carbon plan. It doesn't at all work like that, or we wouldn't need to do, some in-depth modeling. This is simply to show that there's a range of resources. That first tranche of resources have a range of impacts on the system. You start, some early discussion in the chat today by minimizing the problem with, really EE and all demand side programs that are out there. Depending upon penetration rates and customer acceptance and the number of programs, you can get a pretty big range. Clearly, the company's committed to aggressively pursuing demand side and customer programs. to minimize the amount of resources that are needed to solve the issue. We have on here solar, some examples of tools in the toolbox with solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, new nuclear, combined cycle resources. And then what we're showing here is, again, a combined cycle in North Carolina and one not in North Carolina. I think importantly, again, we're not prejudging whether it's going to be in North Carolina or not. What we're showing here is if it is in North Carolina, it's still displacing something that's more carbon intense. Think of it like perhaps a hybrid vehicle displacing an old Ford F-150. You're reducing carbon, even though it's still carbon emitting, but you're not reducing it as much as if you got a Tesla. Now, if I'm looking at it in North Carolina, if that combined cycle isn't in North Carolina, well, it's carbon reducing for the system. It has a bigger impact on North Carolina carbon reductions. So it's reducing carbon for the system, and it's reducing, it has a bigger, just from the way the carbon accounting works, it has a bigger impact on North Carolina reduction. So as on your path, and again, this is that interim path to 70% on a way to net zero, which is total system net zero by 2050. These are just some of the tools in the toolbox that can take you along that path to 70%. So again, we have some key considerations there at the bottom. And I couldn't agree more. I think John mentioned earlier, one of our stakeholders saying, if you're looking at this from total system, we're all on. Well, we're definitely looking at this from total system, but we do have to recognize, because the law calls for us to recognize, when you report your carbon reductions, show me, what you're going to get in North Carolina, and we're going to show what's in total system. And just to point out, again, so I like the comments on what's the keep your eye on the prize, or start with the end in mind. Well, a 70% reduction, even if it was 70% North Carolina, 67%, let's say, just because of how the accounting works, total system, that would be industry leading carbon reduction. You're looking at something that's probably in the 300-ish pounds per megawatt hour. This is, almost global leading. So this is aggressive. Wherever that, accounting, wherever that combined cycle could be placed in this example, and again, high level example, it's part of a much bigger plan to reduce total system emissions at a very aggressive pace. So I'll just leave it at that. It just sort of sets the framework a little bit to show there's lots of tools that are going to be needed, both on our way to 70%, but certainly on our way to net zero by 50. Next slide, please. Final slide. So if you look at potential pathways, so, okay, that's great. You just showed me on the slide above, here's a bunch of tools in the toolbox. How do you organize those into potential pathways to that 70%, as well as the net zero by 50? There's clearly, what we tried to represent on the right is there's two sets of portfolios that need to be examined. Certain portfolios that include the technologies called out in House Bill 951, which specifically were new nuclear and offshore wind, and then portfolios that don't envision those being part of the 70%. Again, that doesn't mean they're not part of your net zero, but if they're not part of your 70%, then there's a different set of portfolios you may want to look at. Now, within each of those, it's not prejudging those to say, hey, any of the technologies are equal or likely. That's part of the evaluation process, part of the development process. What we're really looking at here is you have a few portfolios that have those. It might be portfolios that have one or the other of those technologies or both. So in the bucket on the right, you could have portfolios that have only offshore wind. You could have portfolios that have only new nuclear as part of it. Again, you're not going to get all the way there with these resources. Or you could have portfolios that have both. Portfolios on the left, you've got other tools in the toolbox. We saw, onshore wind. You saw the new combined cycles, energy efficiency. And so there's different constraints that might allow you to have different levels of those resources in different mixes and buckets that will define a set of portfolios that do not include the newer technologies called for under 951. So to cover the waterfront and really evaluate portfolios that the legislation called out, we need to envision some portfolios that rely on the new technologies, some that don't. And then within those general categories, some portfolios that have different levels of tools available to it under that portfolio. And we talked a lot about there are going to be trade-offs, both quantitative and qualitative, that are listed there on the left in terms of the pace of CO2 reduction, the affordability, feasibility of implementation, different technology risk, diversity, et cetera, that each of the portfolios will be evaluated against. And looking at, we recognize that different portfolios are going to have different reliance on technologies that are at different levels of maturity. You need to acknowledge that going in as you look at each of these portfolios and evaluate them. So while all of these portfolios will have different levels of the tools to meet that interim target, that last point I think is really important, which is at the end of the day, we're developing portfolios that are part of a global portfolio that's going to lead to carbon neutrality or net neutrality by 2050. So again, I think that, when you first pre-read these, you might think, oh, there's actually some selected portfolio. That is not the case. Or there is, we're making relative judgments of which resources are better or worse. That's not the case here either. All we're trying to do at this step is to say, here are the tools, here are the resources. Adam spent a little time on it this morning talking about the technologies that could be available to reach this 70%. And then as you develop a finite number of portfolios, you'll have different mixes of those resources or those tools that get you to that 70%. And then the remaining 30% will be taken out by 2050. So again, I know, we knew when we sent these, you start seeing actual numbers. People are going to start assuming that no decisions have been made on which resources are going to be part of the preferred plan. This is simply to frame out how the portfolios are the current thinking on how the portfolios will be developed and organized in order to really comply with 951, as well as just, to maintain our prudent planning processes where you want to make sure you're looking at an array of potential portfolios from a very holistic perspective as you drive in towards a preferred portfolio. So I went through that relatively fast. I knew there would be a lot of discussion on this, and I wanted